Sorry to get cut off there, but we left it at page 29, where Socrates says, "Consider the matter in yet another way. When the soul and the body are united, nature ordains the one to be a slave and to be ruled, and the other to be a master and to rule." This is the very central Socratic idea that the soul or mind is the ruling element of the human being, and the body and the desires are the ruled element in a well-ordered person. It's a big issue in Plato's Republic. Tell me once again, which do you think is like the divine, and which is like the mortal? Do you not think that the divine naturally rules and has authority, and that the mortal naturally is ruled and is a slave? I do. Then which is the soul like? That is quite plain, Socrates. The soul is like the divine, and the body is like the mortal. So if the divine is what is the invisible, it's called here the invisible realm, the realm of ideas, the realm of eternal, unchangeable truths like the forms and mathematical ideas like the Pythagorean theorem or all the other truths of mathematics, perhaps logic. If the soul is like them, then the soul is eternal and unchangeable, and is not the kind of thing that we have to worry about dying. It's physical things that deteriorate. That's why he talks about the compound and the simple, the compound and the composite. Physical things are composite. They're made up of parts, and those parts eventually disintegrate, or that whole eventually disintegrates into its parts. Whereas an absolute idea, like, say, the idea of mathematical equality, or an idea of a number, or the idea of the form, if Socrates is right about them, is simple. It's not made of parts, and we don't have to worry about its dissolution, right? As he says here, and what is uncompounded alone is not liable to dissolution. So this is actually really, I think, a really strong argument, and it is why Socrates says that if his theory of forms is wrong, then his theory of immortality is wrong, because it seems like his strongest argument for the immortality of the soul is that it is like the invisible realm of ideas. After all, it's how we know the ideas, so it must have some affinity with it, rather than like the visible realm of physical things, which, as he says, are always changing and are temporary and ephemeral and do die. It's actually, I think, a really interesting idea. It's a really interesting argument for the immortality of the soul, which is basically that the soul is like the ideas. And there's more sort of stuff about how the philosopher has a contempt for physical pleasure and tries in life to make his soul as pure as possible. But then here on page 35 is really maybe the third part of the dialogue. Very, very important part, in which Socrates has pretty much given it his best shot in terms of giving arguments for the immortality of the soul. And then there's a pause. This is on page 35, right here. Remember, Phaedo is still narrating this to Echecrates. He's still narrating this, telling Echecrates what was said. And he says, at these words, there was a long silence. Socrates himself seemed to be absorbed in his argument, and so were most of us. Cebes and Simmias conversed for a little by themselves. When Socrates observed them, he said, "What? Do you think that our reasoning is incomplete? It still offers many points of doubt and attack, if it is to be examined thoroughly." Which is a really startling admission, or an interesting admission, or maybe just, very humble on Socrates' part. He's basically saying, I know that my argument is not a knockdown, drag-out argument in favor of the immortality of the soul. It offers many points of doubt if it is to be examined thoroughly. If you are discussing another question, I have nothing to say, but if you have any difficulty about this one, do not hesitate to tell me what it is. And if you are of the opinion that the argument should be stated in a better way, explain your views yourselves and take me along with you if you think you will be more successful in my company. Simmias replied, well, Socrates, I will tell you the truth. Each of us has a difficulty, and each has been pushing on the other and urging him to ask you about it. We were anxious to hear what you have to say, but we were reluctant to trouble you, for we were afraid that it might be unpleasant to you to be asked questions now. I mean, they're very delicately referring to the fact that he's going to die soon, so it might be in bad taste to question his arguments for the immortality of the soul. But Socrates, being Socrates, is more interested in philosophy and truth than anything else. Socrates smiled at this answer and said, dear me, Simmias, I shall find it hard to convince other people that I do not consider my fate a misfortune when I cannot even convince even you of it. I mean, what I said before, Socrates is saying about the philosopher welcoming death, like I really meant it, so let's, don't be afraid to question my arguments here. You seem to think me inferior in prophetic power to the swans. And then he goes on this wonderful thing about the swans. But he's basically encouraging them to, go ahead, question my arguments. They're not obviously true arguments. Go ahead. It's okay. I'm not offended by it. So here Simmias offers a challenge, a very important and interesting challenge on page 36 to everything that Socrates has said about the soul and its immortality. Let's take a look at it. He says, good. I will tell you my difficulty, and Cebes will tell you why he is dissatisfied with your statement. I think, Socrates, and I dare say you think so too, that it is very difficult and perhaps impossible to obtain clear knowledge about these matters in this life, which is a very, very important thing to say. And yes, Socrates would agree with that it is very difficult and perhaps impossible to obtain clear knowledge about these matters in this life. Because after all, this is a metaphysical question. This is not an empirical question, and a question that can be determined through observation, a question that can be determined one way or another through experience, like my earlier statement about global warming. We know that the globe is warming, but we know it through our experience. We know because we can point to certain things in the world that determine it. A metaphysical question is a question that is a question about things that aren't open to those sort of methods of verification. We must, so yet I should hold him to be a very poor creature who did not test what is said about them in every way and persevere until he had examined the question from every side and could do no more. This is very, very good stuff from Simmias here. It is our duty to do one of two things. We must learn, or we must discover for ourselves the truth of these matters, or if that be impossible, we must take the best and most irrefragable of human doctrines and, embarking on that, as on a raft, risk the voyage of life. Unless a stronger vessel, some divine word, could be found on which we might take our journey more safely and more securely. And now, after what you have said, I shall not be ashamed to put a question to you, and then I shall not have to blame myself hereafter for not having said now what I think. Like, after all, this is his last chance of talking to Socrates, so he's going to take it. Cebes and I have been considering your argument, and we think that it is hardly sufficient, which is a really incredible thing to say, right? We think your arguments are weak, Socrates. But Socrates, being Socrates, again, is not offended by that, right? I dare say you are right, my friend, said Socrates. But tell me, where is it insufficient? To me, it is insufficient, he replied, because the very same argument might be used of a harmony in a lyre and its strings. Okay, we know what a lyre is. It was a stringed musical instrument of that time. It might be said that the harmony in a tuned lyre is something unseen and incorporeal and perfectly beautiful and divine, while the lyre and its strings are corporeal and with the nature of bodies and compounded and earthly and akin to the mortal. Now, suppose that when the lyre is broken and the strings are cut or snapped, a man were to press the same argument that you have used and were to say that the harmony cannot have perished and that it must still exist, for it cannot possibly be that the lyre and the strings, with their mortal nature, continue to exist, though those strings have been broken, while the harmony, which is of the same nature as the divine and the mortal, and akin to them, has perished, and perished before the mortal lyre. He would say that the harmony itself must still exist somewhere, right? Siebes is saying that this is absurd, right? It would be absurd to say that after the corporeal material strings or the lyre itself had destroyed, that the harmony it produced must still exist somewhere, that would be absurd, right? He would say that the harmony itself must still exist somewhere, and that the wood and the strings will rot away before anything happens to it. And I think, Socrates, that you too must be aware that many of us believe the soul to be most probably a mixture and harmony of the elements by which our body is, as it were, strong and held together, such as heat and cold and dry and wet and the like, when they are mixed together well and in due proportion. Now, if the soul is a harmony, it is clear that when the body is relaxed out of proportion or overstrung by disease or other evils, the soul, though most divine, must perish at once, like other harmonies of sound and of all works of art, while what remains of each body must remain for a long time until it be burned or rotted away. What then shall we say to a man who asserts that the soul, being a mixture of the elements of the body, perishes first at what is called death, which is an astounding thing to say and a very powerful one at this point in this dialogue, in this dramatic context. Basically, what has Simmias said? Well, Socrates has made this division between the visible realm, which is the material realm, which is the body, and the invisible realm, the realm of ideas and intellectual things, which is the soul, or which the soul is like, and has said that the soul cannot die like the body. Simmias is offering an alternative theory of the relation between body and soul here, where he's acknowledged that the soul is something divine and invisible, but crucially, he said it's like the harmony of a lyre, where the harmony exists apart from the lyre, but it's dependent upon the lyre. It's produced by the lyre. So that if you destroy the lyre, you also destroy the harmony. What is the soul? We're something immaterial, something, let's call it even spiritual or non-physical, but it were produced by the organism, the body. Then, when the body dies, which it clearly does, the soul would disappear as well. This, if you're, thinking about the philosophy of death, if you're thinking about the major questions of death, this is a very powerful theory, because basically what it said is that consciousness or mind or soul or spirit or whatever you want to call that aspect of human beings, which is non-physical, that it exists in a dependent relationship with body, and that it can't exist without it. So Epicurus was right. Death really is the end. This is a tremendous challenge to what Socrates wants to prove. Because after all, he wants to prove that the soul is immortal. And to do that, he has to prove that the soul can exist independently of body. And here is a direct challenge to that. And really everything else of philosophical interest, I would say, in the dialogue is Socrates' attempt to meet this challenge. prove that this notion of soul as harmony is a mistake.